Would you kindly? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find? Would you kindly get this thing? Would you kindly head to Ryan's office and kill the son of a bitch?
Imagine witnessing the genesis of a new art form. It is loud, it defies the established definitions of art, it appeals primarily to children and serves to excite and titillate. It is instantly profitable and can be reproduced and distributed en masse. I'm speaking, of course, about film. In the late 19th century, the rise of film led to a century dominated by a new form of expression that combined elements of established art forms, namely theater and literature. Several decades into the life of this new medium, the question, "What is a film?" would most likely have been met with a response that included descriptions of pie fights, car chases, and Keystone Cops. That all changed in 1915 with D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, a film believed to be the earliest example of the feature-length motion picture and largely credited for defining the visual language of feature film narrative. Despite the fact that the film is historically inaccurate and completely offensive by most modern standards, it has been preserved by the Library of Congress for its significant contribution to establishing film as an art form. Very few people would argue against this decision, and even fewer would argue that the film is not art. Yet we find ourselves in this digital era in precisely that position with video games. We take for granted the artistic value of jazz music and musical theater, yet we seem to conveniently forget that upon introduction, both jazz and musical theater inhabited the same dubious social standing that film once inhabited and video games now do. The video game as we know it began life in 1947 as a cathode ray tube amusement device invented by Thomas T. Goldsmith Jr. and Ethel Ray Mann. Over the decades, this new digital form of entertainment was expanded upon through mainframe computer games, the arcades of the 1970s, and the PCs and home consoles of the 1980s on. As the technology became more sophisticated, so too did the games. Mirroring the evolution of film, improved technology led to the development of new techniques and the addition of narrative structures that moved beyond mere amusement. Further technological leaps would inspire more complex stories, character development, and animation. Just as the evolution of film prompted a cultural and critical shift from "is it bad for us" to "is it art?", video games have now found themselves at the center of that very debate. Film critic Roger Ebert famously declared in 2006 that video games can never be art, and expanded on this axiom in a 2010 blog post. Although the question of video games as art had been debated for some time before this, Ebert's remarks seemed to strike a chord with gamers and game designers, giving new life to the debate. He was instantly inundated with emails from gamers attempting to persuade him to change his tune, eventually leading him to publish a retraction. That is, his opinion hadn't changed, but he admitted that he shouldn't have expressed it in the first place, due to his inexperience with the subject matter. So is Mr. Ebert correct to say that video games can never be art? In a word, no. To begin, it is irresponsibly assumptive to make unequivocal claims about what something could or could never be. But beyond this, we have to understand what defines art before we can decide what art isn't. To pin down a satisfactory definition of art is a monumental task. Art is an aesthetic object. Art is meant to be looked at and appreciated for its own sake. Its special qualities set art apart so that it is often placed away from everyday life, in museums, caves, or churches, though much of it was made to be lived with. Janssen's History of Art is widely considered to be a definitive authority on art in the Western world, yet this is a pretty vague definition to say the least. Unfortunately, this is par for the course. Definitions vary from dictionary to dictionary, journal to journal, textbook to textbook. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy has a 5,000-word entry under the definition of art that concludes by lamenting the unwieldy concept of the question, "What is art?" Through all of the various definitions of art, there are essentially 2 points on which all seem to agree. The first is that art is an expression of human creativity. The second is that there are many types of art. As game design consultant Ernest W. Adams points out, literary arts are characterized by the presence of narrative. Film and television belong to the literary arts. Then there are the fine arts, sculpture and painting, music and dance. He goes on to describe other types, including architecture and decorative arts. With all of this vagueness, just about anything could fall into these definitions or types, but at least it's a starting point. Given the subjective nature of defining art, it may prove more constructive to draw a distinction between art and popular culture. As Adams points out, popular culture consists of creative works whose primary goal is to entertain, while art seeks to question. The line between them is not hard and fast. There is an overlap, a gray area where pop culture can be art and art can be pop culture. Art is not inherently pedagogical, although that may be a side effect, but it explores complex ideas through feeling, emotion, and aesthetic. As video games adhere to these definitions, it may be simple to just say video games can do all of these things, so games are art, end of story. Of course, nothing is that simple, and there's a major sticking point for critics: interactivity. Both Ebert and Adams argue that interactivity precludes art, that art is a form of communication between the artist to the viewer, and if the viewer starts to interfere, the message is lost. In response to author Clive Barker's assertion that the game experience is art, Ebert takes this a step further to say, if you can go through every emotional journey available, doesn't that devalue each and every one of them? Art seeks to lead you to an inevitable conclusion, not a smorgasbord of choices. If next time I have Romeo and Juliet go through the story naked and standing on their hands, would that be way cool or what? The real kicker here is that they're half right. Art is a communication between the artist and the audience, and art does seek to lead the audience to an inevitable conclusion. We accept that art represents an expression of the artist's thoughts and beliefs, but as our means for communication change rapidly in a digital world, we must evaluate how that can affect the communication between artist and audience. By Ebert and Adams' definition, art represents a one-way communication, a lecture from one person to another. But what happens when the audience is allowed to talk back? What happens when it is no longer a lecture but a dialogue or conversation? Bowling Green University's Stephen Hall examines the nature of this conversation as it relates to authorial control. The disruption of a unidirectional bequeathing of art from active creator to passive viewer through the objet d'art has been called into question. When a person visits an art museum, the works of art occupy their spaces whether or not they are being viewed. If we were to turn art into a verb rather than a noun, we could say that the works in a museum are arting at us or arting in our general direction. We can ignore them, we can engage them, but the objects don't cease to communicate their message when nobody is around. By the same token, they do not require our participation in order for the message to be communicated. They only require that we pay attention. Film is very much a product and artifact from this era of passive art. A film plays whether you're in the theater or not, and if you are in the theater, you're only allowed to watch. The digital era, however, does not just offer participation, it demands it. The internet, social networking sites like Facebook and Twitter, and creative media sites like YouTube offer us the opportunity to engage each other and our media in new ways. If art is communication, and communication is changing, then art, or our definition of art, must also change or risk losing its place in the new cultural landscape. Hall describes the relationship between game designer and audience as a collaborative process, not unlike the teamwork upon which the majority of film productions is predicated. Moreover, video games as a medium offer a combination of old and new aesthetics for consideration. While I agree that the artistic value of video games lies in their ability to engage the audience as active participants in the work, I feel that calling the player a collaborator may be offering too much credit to the role of the player. What is interesting in Hall's statement, though, is that it suggests that the artist is dependent upon the audience in a way similar to forms of performance-based art. Grant Tavenor of Lincoln University, New Zealand, suggests the idea that video games are mass art, a subset of art that includes film and is notable for its dependence on being reproduced. Some artworks are embodied in single objects. The Washington Monument, for example, finds its singular location in the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Other works can have multiple instances and can be instantiated at multiple discrete locations and times. What Tavenor finds problematic, though, is that mass art by definition relies on an untutored audience. That is to say, specialized knowledge is not necessary to understanding and enjoying a work designated as mass art. He explains that a lack of gaming skills, which are built up slowly over a significant period of gaming, can be a real barrier to new players. However, it could just as easily be argued that the ability to understand and appreciate a film or piece of music that moves beyond pop culture into the realm of art requires a knowledge and vocabulary that is also built up over a significant period of exposure to the medium. Hall suggests bringing British philosopher Richard Wollheim into the conversation by describing Wollheim's three approaches to defining art. The realist, where aesthetic quality has an absolute value independent of any human view. The objectivist, where it is assigned an absolute value that depends on general human experience. And the relativist position, where there is no absolute value, but a fluid one that varies with different human experiences. Considering the fluid nature of art and human expression, as well as the current era of enhanced or fluid communication, wouldn't it make the most sense to consider the relativist position and say that perhaps video games are the new language of literary arts, or at the very least, a new dialect of that language? Another sticking point that derives from the interactivity factor is the very nature of a game. As Mr. Ebert points out, one obvious difference between art and games is that you can win a game. It has rules, points, objectives, and an outcome. Kelly Santiago might cite an immersive game without points or rules, but I would say then it ceases to be a game and becomes a representation of a story, a novel, a play, dance, a film. Those are things you cannot win, you can only experience them. There are several things wrong with this statement. First, what Mr. Ebert fails to acknowledge here is that every form of art has rules, objectives, and an outcome. It's how we separate Impressionism from Surrealism, sculpture from architecture. The only difference is that nobody is keeping score. Co-founder of that game company, Kelly Santiago, to whom he refers, cites numerous examples of games she considers to be art, including Flower, a game that places players in control of the wind with the objective of blowing flower petals across a landscape in an attempt to create harmony between the urban and the natural world. The game is clearly an expression of what the designer interprets as the balance between men and nature. Mr. Ebert seems confused by this game, asking, "Do you win if you're the first to find the balance between the urban and the natural?" Mr. Ebert can hardly be blamed for this confusion. This is, after all, a game we're talking about, and the point of any game is to win, except when that isn't the point. Aaron Smuts, professor of philosophy at Rhode Island College, explains why sports and games such as chess could not be art as such. Competition is considered inimical to artistic creation because it locates the purpose behind the production in non-aesthetic goals. Smuts is correct in this assertion, however the evolution of the video game medium has created something that in most common forms barely resembles a game in the traditional sense. The object of most video games is to complete the game, not win. By completing specific tasks, sometimes scored, sometimes not, the player is rewarded with more of the narrative. In any case, the score is not the object, completing the narrative is. In the case of immersive games like World of Warcraft and simulations like The Sims, the act of playing and inhabiting the world becomes the narrative. To argue that competition-based games like Madden Football preclude video games from being art is like saying The Sopranos can't be art because of Monday Night Football. Additionally, it's problematic to claim that a video game emphasizing narrative and immersion ceases to be a game and instead becomes a representation of a story. This is hypocritical at best and at worst an argument of semantics with a dangerous double standard. What is film if not a representation of a story? Tchaikovsky's Sleeping Beauty is the representation of a classic fairy tale adapted for ballet. Narrative is suggested through movement and the language of dance and music. The ballet does not cease to be a dance because it is representing a story from another medium any more than a video game ceases to be a game because it tells a story. The simple fact is, video games are representations of stories and have been for decades. By claiming otherwise, one is simply claiming that his understanding of video games will not allow for the possibility of narrative. In 2005, Sony Computer Entertainment released Shadow of the Colossus for the PlayStation 2 game system. The story centers on the journey of a boy, Wander, who seeks to resurrect a girl named Mono. He travels to a distant land seeking the aid of a mysterious deity called Dorman, who can allegedly resurrect the dead. This is a fairly standard setup for a fantasy adventure story, but part of what makes Colossus unique is that the journey to the Forbidden Land is not where the action takes place. The story begins when Wander enters the Forbidden Land and is sent on a new quest. Dorman's disembodied voice greets Wander and claims that he can in fact resurrect Mono, but that he has been cursed and stripped of his powers. In order to return Dorman's power, Wander must seek out the monstrous beasts that roam the land and kill them. Immediately, the player sets out on this journey, never questioning. Video games up to this point have conditioned audiences with objective-based gameplay for years. Go from point A to point B, kill everything in your way, and rescue the princess. An adolescent male power fantasy promising an objectified token of victory, a chance to live out the monomyth. Only this isn't that game. There are no hordes of mindless enemies waiting to be killed. There's only Wander, his horse Aggro, and a desolate landscape. There are no points to be earned, no power-ups, and when the player confronts the first of the Colossi, he embarks on the monumental task of bringing it down. After a lengthy struggle, the sensation of elated victory is immediate. Wander is praised by Dorman and sent out to find the next beast. What happens next is frightfully unsettling. The player must begin to feel. Over the course of the adventure, which lasts for about 15 to 20 hours, the player may begin to notice that the land becomes more desolate with every successful kill, and Wander himself begins to change. Was he always that pale? Were his eyes always that dark? Or is it just my imagination? That's silly, why would I imagine that? Slowly, victory ceases to hold that sense of elation, and the player may begin to question why Wander persists. But in true video game fashion, he moves forward, silently propelled by the player, despite the player's growing sensation that these actions may in fact be wrong. In the end, these feelings are justified, as Dorman proves to be a malevolent entity. Mono is resurrected just in time to see Wander transformed into the embodiment of evil as Dorman takes control. On its own, the story in Colossus is a classic tale of man becoming the monster he fights, and a powerful examination of how far a person might go to save another. The narrative structure follows the traditions of film and literature as the past, present, and future of these characters in the Forbidden Land slowly unfolds. As a video game, however, its power is magnified. Dr. Henry Jenkins, director of comparative media studies at MIT, points out that early filmmakers took the very machinery of the industrial age, which many felt dehumanizing, and found within it the resources for expressing individual visions, for reasserting basic human needs, desires, and fantasies. This is precisely what has occurred in our own time, as video game developers have done the exact same thing with the machinery of the digital age. It isn't the story itself that holds the power in Shadow of the Colossus, although the story is very good on its own, but the player's relationship to the story, the characters, and the setting. Borrowing from Mr. Ebert's suggestion that he make Romeo and Juliet go through the story naked and standing on their hands, he misses the point. The narrative structure of a video game does not give the player that freedom, most of the time, but rather positions the player so that he or she has been driven down the narrative path and must choose to drink the poison, as it were. The choice is not whether or not Juliet will drink the poison, as the narrative demands it of the player, but instead engages the player directly with the action of drinking the poison. A more apt comparison would be to borrow from Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Wilde plays with narrative structure by hinting at but rarely showing Dorian's terrible deeds, appealing to and teasing the voyeuristic tendencies of human nature. In Chapter 13, it all comes to a head when Wilde describes in gory detail the grisly murder of Basil Hallward. What Wilde does so masterfully is to withhold information for 12 chapters, teasing our voyeurism and then giving us precisely what we have been speculating about in truly horrific fashion. In the end, he has made us complicit in Dorian's actions by inviting us to witness the terrifying murder. While we are made complicit to Dorian's actions, the conventions of literature keep the audience a safe distance away. The page serves as a barrier to the act. Similarly, with film, the audience may witness but not participate. With film, the barrier is even greater, as a viewer may close their eyes to avoid seeing the event being depicted. The video game medium offers no such comfort, as the narrative will not continue without the active participation of the audience. A game like Shadow of the Colossus makes the player commit the horrific act, but then asks if the action was justified, and at what cost. Taking this idea even further is 2007's BioShock. Developed by Irrational Games and created by designer Ken Levine, BioShock places players in the role of Jack, a faceless everyman and the sole survivor of a plane crash somewhere over the Atlantic in 1960. The idea of Jack as a faceless individual is important here, as the game is presented in a first-person perspective like Doom or Duke Nukem 3D. This limited perspective is designed to create a sense of immersion in which the player becomes the character. As Jack swims to safety, he soon finds himself in a bizarre underwater city called Rapture, the brainchild of eccentric billionaire Andrew Ryan, an odd mix of Ayn Rand and Howard Hughes. Rapture is founded on the ideals of Ayn Rand's objectivist philosophy, namely the idea that man should be free to create unhindered and the great should not be constrained by the small. Of course, this leads to the city's downfall and a cautionary tale of science gone wrong. The discovery of genetic engineering, or splicing in the game's vernacular, leads to a sort of genetic arms race that transforms the citizens into horrible caricatures of their former selves. The story is an odd mix of philosophy, science fiction, and horror that is more fully realized than most modern films. Over the course of the game, the story of the city's downfall unfolds as Jack navigates the ruins, finding journals and recorded diaries, much like the narrative structure of Bram Stoker's Dracula. In all of this, Jack finds an ally in one of the city's survivors, a man calling himself Atlas. Over the course of the game, Atlas communicates with Jack via radio, often providing objectives and useful information, with the end goal being the death of Andrew Ryan and escape from the city. As Jack explores the city, the player is free to determine how they interact with the other citizens of Rapture. Shoot on sight and loot them for ammo and supplies? Only attack in self-defense, as many of Rapture's splicers will ignore Jack altogether? Rescue the Little Sisters, genetically engineered children who harvest the raw materials used for splicing? Or kill them and take the raw materials himself? All the while, Atlas is buzzing in Jack's ears. Would you kindly go here? Would you kindly do this? Would you kindly head to Ryan's office and kill that son of a bitch? About two-thirds of the way through the game, the player finally meets Andrew Ryan and is confronted with an awful truth. Jack has been genetically engineered to follow any instruction preceded by the phrase, "Would you kindly?" Control is wrenched away from the player as Andrew Ryan declares a man chooses, a slave obeys. The player is left contemplating all of the actions he or she chose to do at Atlas's prompting, while remaining helpless to watch Jack's actions unfold at Ryan's instruction.
Would you kindly? Powerful phrase. Familiar phrase.
Would you kindly? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly head to Ryan's office and kill the son of a bitch?
Sit, would you kindly? Stand, would you kindly? Run! Stop! Turn. A man chooses. A slave obeys. Kill! A man chooses! A slave obeys!
Anthony Birch of popular gaming website Destructoid sums up this scene nicely. It stands as the single greatest non-interactive cutscene in gaming history, ever. As a storytelling device, non-interactivity is used as a weapon against the player. You don't want to question why you're doing what you're doing? Fine, you're nothing better than a mindless robotic slave, and you have essentially given up the human gift of choice. Having control taken away is, within the context of the story, a tangible punishment for accepting things on face value and blindly following orders. What Shadow of the Colossus and BioShock both demonstrate is that the element of choice in video games is one of the greatest illusions in modern creative media. Colossus uses interactivity to guide the player down a specific narrative path leading to a predetermined narrative conclusion, forcing the player to question his own part in the action. BioShock plays with the interactive conventions of the medium to lure the player into a false sense of freedom, only to yank it away at a critical moment in the narrative and point an accusatory finger at the audience. Borrowing the Dorian Gray metaphor, BioShock places players in Dorian's shoes, hands them the knife, says, "Would you kindly kill?" and then proclaims, "Now look what you've done." Ironically, Aaron Smuts points out an inherent defect in mass art being that it reduces the audience to mindless drones, thereby prohibiting the free play of the imagination genuine art provokes. If the chief defect of mass art is its passivity, then the active participation required of video games could ostensibly raise the medium above the artistic and intellectual capabilities of film, music, or literature. It only takes a designer who aspires to this level of artistic ingenuity. In BioShock, Ken Levine's masterful twist doesn't just force the audience to question their choices or their relationship to the game world. It is a fourth-wall shattering case of Ken Levine speaking directly to the audience on the nature of the medium. "A man chooses, a slave obeys" is more than a rumination on Jack's Manchurian Candidate-style trigger. It is a challenge to the medium to demand more of the audience utilizing a powerful tool unique to video games, self-reflection. As Shadow of the Colossus, BioShock, and every other video game demonstrate, self-reflection, or rather self-deconstruction, is a unique quality of the medium. It is virtually impossible to create a game that does not address its own gameness, whether through on-screen button prompts, an objective flashing on the screen, or simply the existence of an instruction manual. Ewan Kirkland of Buckinghamshire Children's University College asserts video games' dependence upon user participation necessitates the frequent provision of explicit commands, while the physical input required from players means their role in this process is continuously underlined. Unlike film or literature, where breaking the fourth wall is a conscious choice, this element becomes an inherent part of the language of video games. Film serves to create the illusion of reality on screen, while the video game, by its very nature, embraces the artifice of the medium, ironically establishing a greater connection to the audience by representing an immediate relationship to the contents of that medium. Oddly enough, critics seem to heap praise upon games that remove as much of this relationship as possible. In a New York Times review of 2008's Metal Gear Solid 4: Guns of the Patriots, reviewer Seth Schissel positively gushes over the lustrous production values, meticulous attention to its visual style, and the power and energy of its presentation. The only problem? A lot of that depth isn't interactive. Metal Gear Solid, a series famous for its lengthy cutscenes featuring extended exposition requiring no input from the player, isn't the only example of this. Smuts spends a great deal of time praising the noir roots of Max Payne and the cinematic use of lens flares in Halo. While these elements are well executed and situate games as spiritual successors to the visual language of film, it begs the question, why must video games imitate other forms of art to be worthy of critical praise? As Jensen points out, we need to read art and architecture on their own terms, yet we try to read video games as like a film. I'm guilty of this myself, as I've spent a great deal of time here describing video game conventions in the language of film. So what needs to happen for the language of video games to be widely understood and recognized as art on their own terms? In short, video games need to grow up. Aside from the problematic term game, video games as an industry are still widely regarded as a toy. Despite the efforts of studios like Irrational Games or Team Ico, the studio behind Shadow of the Colossus, many in the industry still approach game design as a toy or an action movie. The astronomical profits generated by the Call of Duty franchise have led to the demise of games like 6 Days in Fallujah. While Call of Duty places players in the role of soldiers moving from one Michael Bay-style set piece to the next with little to no context or reflection on the horrors of war, Fallujah was designed as a tactical shooter examining the events of Operation Phantom Fury, also known as the Second Battle of Fallujah, with the goal of highlighting the experience of the soldiers and examining the politics, experiences, and philosophies behind the conflict. Following the announcement of the game, the public outcry was almost immediate, questioning the appropriateness of making a toy out of recent real-life conflicts. Despite the lack of validity to this claim, the game was dropped by its publisher, Konami. Adams, in his critique of video games as art, described most video games as the video equivalent of a theme park, and declares that game developers must experiment with their medium. They must try new things and take risks. But if they're not allowed to do this, how will the medium ever move forward? Game designer Warren Spector is quoted as saying, "We're still making and remaking The Great Train Robbery or Birth of a Nation, or to be really generous, maybe we're at the beginning of what might be called our talkies period." The thing is, the game industry has already made its Birth of a Nation. The technological boom of the 1990s brought about revolutionary games like Doom, Wolfenstein 3D, and The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. While the content in games like Doom and Wolfenstein could barely be considered narrative and calls into question the use of gratuitous violence in the medium, they firmly established the visual language of the video game, and Ocarina of Time pushed the language of narrative in video games to new places. In recent years, games like BioShock and Shadow of the Colossus have come to represent a pinnacle of design and storytelling that integrates narrative into the gameplay experience. Critics like Roger Ebert claim that video games cannot be art because they have no masterpieces akin to Citizen Kane, yet these same critics ignore the masterpieces or flatly refuse to play them, as is the case of Mr. Ebert. It is akin to declaring that film is not art and then refusing to watch Citizen Kane or 2001: A Space Odyssey. Video games have entered their talkies period, and it is clear that they have a lot to say. We only have to be willing to listen.
Somewhere beyond the sea, somewhere waiting for me, my lover stands on golden sands and watches the ships that go sailing. Somewhere beyond the sea, she's there watching for me. If I could fly like birds on